What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Danny and Bush coming at you today with the strength of schedule overview. Today, we're going to be focusing on the passing games, so the quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends, what their strength of schedule looks like, how we can expect them to have an early season schedule, mid-season schedule, and what their playoff schedule is going to look like. We're basically going to be doing an entire overview of this just to make sure that you guys are aware if you draft certain players, maybe they have like 3 really difficult matchups at the beginning of the season. I think this is one of the more underrated parts of fantasy. People tend to not talk about it all offseason. And then as soon as the season starts, we suddenly care about strength of schedule, which to me doesn't really make a lot of sense. But either way, Danny, how you doing today?
Doing well. And yeah, like people just don't talk about the schedule whatsoever leading up to the season. They talk about the players, but in actuality, differentiating mostly between tiers is looking at the schedule, seeing, okay, what are my players expected to go against in those first 5-6 weeks of the season? Because let's be honest, when you're trying to forecast a season, it's way too early to look at weeks 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Like if you were at least are able to gauge the first few weeks of the season, use your own knowledge, use your own projection, you can kind of see what defenses should be good, what defenses should be bad, and what should ultimately lend some of these players as being buy low or potentially sell high targets. So yeah, this is definitely a very underrated part of fantasy, but if you're able to get it down pat, can give you a very good comparative advantage to the rest of your league mates.
Right. And I think when you're drafting a fantasy team, you're drafting for the beginning of the season. You're going to make moves. You're going to make waiver pickups. You're going to make trades. So the early season schedule is really what we care about, especially for certain positions like quarterbacks and defenses, for example. We always want to know what the early season schedule is because that's when we're going to be, streaming those position groups. But either way, I think early season, like you said, is probably the best way to gauge how good a schedule is because you're right. We don't really know by week 14 who's going to be healthy on certain defenses. If the Rams lose Aaron Donald and Jalen Ramsey, they're not going to be a tough defense to go up against. So it's hard to project that far into the future, but either way, we're going to do our best to do that today. So we're going to hit the intro and then we're going to get right into this. So we're going to start off basically by going over some of the hardest corners to play in fantasy. And this, again, is not going to be like overly useful right now, but once we get to the season, this is when it's really going to matter. What we're going to talk about these guys for right now is basically just in reference to their defense, because we're talking about the passing game. Certain teams that we're going to be talking about have number one receivers, and shadow matchups and shadow corners are really important for number one receivers because we have guys like, and you guys can see them on the screen, guys like Tre'Davious White, Jair Alexander, Jalen Ramsey, Xavier Howard, Stephon Gilmore, Marshawn Lattimore, James Bradbury, Darius Slay, Carlton Davis, William Jackson. Those guys were deployed in shadow coverage a lot last year. A lot of them were successful in it. Darius Slay, not so much, but a lot of those guys were pretty successful in shadow coverage. So when you have an Allen Robinson, for example, who's the clear-cut number one receiver on his offense, and he's playing against the Bills, you got to expect that he's going to receive shadow coverage from Tre'Davious White.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, when we're looking at these units, understanding that shadow matchups are going to depict more for number one wide receivers in comparison to the rest of the receiving unit. For example, you could have a really poor defense on the surface. Like if you just look at the numbers, they're a poor passing defense. But if they have one shadow corner, guess what that means? That alpha wide receiver in the other team is probably going to have a rough day, while the rest of the receiving corps is going to be able to pick up the slack. So understanding the context in addition to the numbers that we're going to provide is ultimately how you can gain that edge. If you know, for example, the Saints defense, let's say it's not supposed to be as good this year. They had some pieces on the back end that they lost, shouldn't be as good as they were in recent years past, but they have Marshawn Lattimore. If you have the number 2 wide receiver for a team going against the Saints, you should reasonably expect some good production because of that fact. So being able to understand that should help you out.
Right. And if you guys tuned into my start sit videos this past season, then you guys know that I went over wide receiver cornerback matchups. And in a situation like that, the perfect example of that is my Tampa Bay Buccaneers, because Marshawn Lattimore is glued to Mike Evans every single time that they play each other. And Chris Godwin and Antonio Brown are likely the pieces you want to be starting in those games. So that's exactly how you can use that information practically. But we're going to go through basically the top 5 easiest schedules in terms of passing schedules. Tomorrow we'll talk about running backs and rushing schedules, but we're going to start today with the top 5 easiest passing schedules. And to me, the easiest passing schedule in the league is the Baltimore Ravens. And we used Sharp Football Stats to basically, decipher which schedules are easiest. But we also used a bit of our own judgment as well, because certain defenses lost certain pieces, certain defenses got certain pieces back. It's not necessarily as simple as taking last year's defensive numbers and transferring them over to this year, because the defenses have changed, the offenses have changed, certain offensive lines are worse than each other. So the Baltimore Ravens, though, have the easiest schedule in the league, in my opinion. And when you look at the start to the season that they have the Raiders, the Chiefs, and the Lions the first 3 weeks of the season. And in fantasy, we tend to remember the really early part of the season a lot, because if you think about last year, think about guys like DK Metcalf, who were like just phenomenal to start the season. That kind of sticks into our brain, and it makes it easy to trade those players, right? Because if we have a 2-week sample size, right, let's say it's week 3, and you have Lamar Jackson, Rashad Bateman, Mark Andrews on your team, it's going to be really easy for you to trade those players if you don't believe in them long-term and you want to upgrade potentially to a different quarterback or different wide receiver, or different tight end.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're talking about starts, like you mentioned it, but first of all, that Raiders matchup in particular, Lamar Jackson is actually going to go bonkers. Lamar Jackson may very well rush for like 200 yards in that game, but regardless, even if he doesn't, Rashad Bateman's got his debut against whatever the heck the Raiders are doing on the back end. Mark Andrews is absolutely probably going to catch a touchdown or two in this game. Like, this is a very reasonable situation. And the hardest matchup in those first 3 weeks on paper would be the Chiefs. But in reality, if you actually use the football context to it, this is going to be a very intense, very high scoring type of game with back and forth between the Chiefs and the Ravens. So although it appears as a tough matchup, I wouldn't expect the Ravens players to not do good in that matchup, because they have to keep pace with that high octane Chiefs offense. So if you understand that context, you'll be golden. But yeah, that's kind of what I was alluding to in the intro.
Right. And overall, those first 9 weeks, they have a bye week in there, but the really only scary matchup, in my opinion, is the Broncos. The Broncos are going to have a really good defense next year. They added Pat Surtain to that defense. They're getting their 2 edge rushers back fully healthy this year. Of course, they have a number of other pieces on their defense as well. So they're really only the defense that scares me.
Maybe
sure
there's
going to be some league average defenses like the Colts. Maybe they're a bit better than league average. Chargers might be okay this year. But overall, you got some smash matchups in there with the Raiders, Lions, Bengals, and Vikings. And you also have some not too scary matchups. And that's really what you're looking for. League average doesn't usually have a big impact. It's the really good and the really bad that we care about for strength of schedule. So you mentioned Mark Andrews. He actually, when you look at his numbers and his splits versus easy defenses and difficult defenses, you guys can see on the screen right now, he averages 15.88 PPR points per game against defenses that rank in the bottom half of the league. So this is a guy that generally is better, especially from a touchdown perspective, against easier defenses. So this could be a guy that gets out to a very, very hot start. Maybe if you don't believe in Mark Andrews long-term, you could flip him for a guy like Kyle Pitts, who maybe didn't get off to that hot of a start to start the season, or maybe even one of the big 3 tight ends gets off to a slow start and you could try and upgrade from Andrews to that. So this is all kind of, part of draft strategy, right? If you, let's say you're high on Mark Andrews, this should make you higher on Mark Andrews, knowing that he's going to get out to a quick start.
Yeah, and we'll get into the Raiders in a little bit, but let's say hypothetically Darren Waller has a slowish start and you could package Mark Andrews and, I don't know, an upside wide receiver that you probably took in the 11th, 12th round and go up and upgrade to a Darren Waller. I think that would be the play, because at the end of the day here, if you're comparing player for player, like Darren Waller is basically locked in for 130 targets over the season. So although Mark Andrews might get off to a hotter start, you can use that to your advantage and try to make that upgrade when an owner may be disappointed with a highly drafted player.
Yeah, I totally agree. So let's move on to the next team that is basically second in our easiest schedule, and that is the San Francisco 49ers. And when we can look at their schedule, they have, it's a little bit different than the Ravens. The Ravens had a bit of a harder stretch in the middle of the season. I would say there's a couple games in midseason that are going to be difficult for the Niners, but we get a lucky break knowing that the Rams are in week 18, which doesn't count for fantasy, right? We got to take that into account. So the Niners really, they don't really have tough games all year, to be honest. And if Jimmy Garoppolo starts, he should probably have no issues those first 2 games against the Lions and against the Eagles. But week 3 is probably the point where I would circle when Trey Lance potentially gets in there mid-game or after that game in week 4 that he might see a start, assuming, of course, he doesn't start from the beginning.
Yeah, like overall, I see 3 tougher games in this stretch. I mean, the Packers game is probably going to be a little tough, especially considering the fact that we do see, for whatever reason, the Packers and 49ers always play each other like bitter rivals. I don't know why it is. I mean, maybe the playoff matchups we've seen in the past, but these teams just do not like each other. Maybe it's a little factor that Aaron Rodgers wanted to be a 49er. Who knows? You got that. Packers game is obviously, or the Bears game is obviously going to be tough, and the Rams is the one key figure here. Like, that's probably the best defense in the NFC. So that's going to be a tough stretch. But when you're looking at the schedule overall, they have a really solid opening, I would say, like comparatively to other teams, especially that Lions game where they're going to feast. And then once you get to week 11, I know I mentioned in the prelude, don't look week 11 and on, but man, it's hard not to when you see so many fucking greens at the end of that schedule with the Bengals, the Vikings, the Jaguars, the Falcons, the Titans, the Texans. Like, my lordy, this is just a team that I want as much exposure to in general as possible because they got a good start and a good end based off what we can project as of now.
Right. And when you look at the corners, as I referred to in the intro, talking about the shadow corners, the only two shadow corners that we assume Brandon Ayuk will play is Jalen Ramsey and Jair Alexander, right? Yep. Week 3 and week 10. So we don't really have to worry about any corners. Like, the Bears cut Kyle Fuller. They don't have him on their team anymore. There's really nobody that scares me from Brandon Ayuk's sake other than those two guys. And we don't even know for sure if Ayuk's going to see shadow coverage in general. So this just makes me even more bullish on Brandon Ayuk, to be honest. That's my biggest takeaway from the San Francisco schedule. And the fact that I think Trey Lance is going to get out to a hot start in his NFL career, because I think this is, especially if he does take a little bit of time to get acclimated to the NFL, if he doesn't start until week 6, week 7, week 8, like, his back half of the schedule is just extremely easy.
It's absolutely cake. And I mean, this might sound like a bold prediction right now, but I do think the winner of BBM2 is going to have some sort of Niner stack because that schedule is just absolutely
Texans
beautiful.
In the championship week, too.
Yeah.
And I think we can all agree. We don't want to project forward, but I think we can all agree with absolute certainty.
Texans are going to
by
suck.
Week 17, the Texans are going to stink. And the last thing I want to mention about the 49ers, too, is that they actually had the most difficult schedule in terms of pass efficiency defense blend. And I guess we probably should have explained this from the beginning, but pass efficiency defense blend is the metric that we're using to aggregate these schedules. And basically what that means is that it combines overall pass defense efficiency with their tendency to give up explosive plays. So we want to kind of get a blend of both things, because certain guys get explosive plays, certain guys get just regular, volume, yardage and touchdowns. So that gives you an overall view of both. But either way, the Niners were dead last in the NFL last year in terms of the hardest schedule for pass efficiency defense blend. So this is an area that is a big jump for them, obviously, coming from dead last to like the second best schedule in the league. This should be, for a lot of these guys, a surprise for fantasy.
For sure. So we'll get into the next team. That will be the Jacksonville Jaguars. And as you guys can see on the screen, this young offense has a very favorable opening schedule. They get their easy games out of the way. You see Houston, Cincinnati, and Tennessee in particular. And although the Cardinals there appear at number 8, when you're actually taking into the fact of context, this is a team that lost a lot in the offseason, talking about their number 1 cornerback, talking about their number 1 or number 2 pass rusher from last year in Hassan Reddick and Patrick Peterson. I don't think they're going to be a top 10 passing defense. And in general, like, even if they're a fringe top 10, that's not really a matchup that detracts me from an elite status team that would scare me off the Jaguars. Apart from them, though, the only team that really, really scares me would be the Denver Broncos. Again, that is an absolutely lockdown unit that adds a number 1 cornerback at that 9th overall selection with Patrick Surtain. Aside from that, though, Texans, Vernon Hargreaves, no thank you. Cincinnati Bengals just lost their number 1 corner and is already the number 30 team. Yeah, sure, whatever. And the Tennessee Titans, we all know how bad their secondary is. As good as their offense is, their passing defense is that bad. So I'm super excited for the Jacksonville Jaguars to get off to a hot start, especially when you consider the fact that this is a team, in terms of game script, should be in some pretty favorable situations from both a explosive standpoint as well as a passing volume standpoint to open up the schedule. So if you're taking DJ Chark, Laviska Shenault, Marvin Jones, Trevor Lawrence, expect them to have a decent start to the year with this opening schedule.
Right. And I think Trevor Lawrence, to me, is the biggest takeaway from this, because with quarterbacks, right, we definitely care about the schedule early on. And yeah, like you said, the Broncos really the only team in that first stretch of the season that really scares you. And even the Dolphins, the 49ers, the Rams, the Bills, some of these teams have lost some significant pieces, especially the Dolphins potentially might lose Xavier Howard by the looks of it. Yeah. The Rams lost their defensive coordinator. The 49ers are still, they lost Richard Sherman. They don't really have an elite lockdown corner or anything like that. So a lot of these teams, even some of the decently good defenses, are still going to be a bit rough for the Jacksonville Jaguars. I don't expect the Jaguars to be like a great offense or anything, but it is, helpful knowing that they have a pretty easy schedule for their young quarterback to start his career off on.
Yep, absolutely. So anything else you want to add on the Jaguars, or should we move on to the Vikings?
No, let's go on to the Vikings.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's pretty
The
similar. It's a pretty similar story to the other teams that we talked about with the easy starts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see in those first 8 games of the season, just for the record, again, I love my Cowboys. They're going to be in a bottom half defense against the pass. You got them, you got the Bengals, you got the Browns, you got the Lions, and you got the Seahawks, who, although they're 17th, they did show instances where in high volume passing games where they can go back and forth, they are susceptible to the big play. And in general, honestly, there's no game in that stretch that scares me. Like, yes, again, I mentioned with the Cardinals are number 8 here. Don't expect them to carry that. And the Panthers, average team at
They're a
best?
league average defense. I
Yeah,
think
so
the Seahawks, Cardinals, and Panthers are probably the Browns too. It'll probably all be like league average defenses this year. And again, you get 3 smash spots with the Cowboys, with the Bengals, and with the Lions. So 4 league average defenses and 3 bad defenses in the first 8 games of the season.
yeah,
That's definitely going to help, Kirk Cousins. It's definitely, especially with Kirk Cousins, this really lends itself to Kirk Cousins being a viable streamer, because we know that Kirk Cousins is not a guy that can perform under pressure, not against elite defenses in the NFL. So I would say the biggest takeaway from the Viking schedule is that Cousins is probably going to be a top, 10 quarterback to begin the season.
Yeah, and what I also noticed from the schedule is I wouldn't necessarily say Dalvin or Justin Jefferson because they're such key elite players in fantasy football, but when you get into the Irv Smith Jr., Adam Thielen, Kirk Cousins range, your sell window is after that Dallas game, because after that Dallas game, you may be screwed. Again, we don't like projecting forward, but it's not hard to say the fact that Baltimore, LA, Green Bay, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and the Rams are easy. Like that's just ridiculous. Like it's not hard to say that they're going to be good
back
defenses.
half of the schedule. So the easy part of their schedule obviously comes at the beginning of the season. And again, once we get into mid-season, at this point, we'll probably make reference to the video that we made in the offseason, this video that we're recording, and being like, guys, we should probably start selling our Vikings. And again, not probably Dalvin Cook, or probably not
Justin
Jefferson either, unless you can get, obviously, if they're the number 1 at their position in fantasy at that point, maybe you do sell them. But either way, I think it's still a point where you want to be looking to pivot away from some of these guys, because the Lions are really the only bad defense they'll play for the rest of the season after that Cowboys game. Let's go on to the Bears, and we're sticking in the NFC North here. Yeah. And the Bears, again, they have a very easy start to the season.
Don't start them week 1, though.
Right. Do not start them week 1. For some reason, they put the Rams and Bears on Sunday Night Football week 1. Like, ew. Like, Justin Fields better start that game, or else that game is going to be so boring. It's going to be just an absolute shit stomping of the Rams on the Bears on Sunday Night Football. So I hope Justin Fields does start that game. But I think the easy, or the best case scenario, is that Dalton starts that game, gets it out of the way for Justin Fields, and then Justin Fields takes over for the easy games. The Bengals, the Browns, the Lions, and the Raiders. That's a very favorable stretch over those first 5 games of the season that Fields, if he's the starter, can get off to a pretty quick start. And obviously it gets difficult after that for a good stretch of time with the Bucs, the Niners, the Packers, Steelers, and Ravens. Those are probably, 5 of the top 8 defenses in the NFL. Like, that's going to be a very rough stretch for Fields. But again, towards the back half of the season, it gets a little bit easier again. So this is a bit of a boomer bust schedule, I would say, with, easy, hard, easy as the way it goes throughout the schedule. But I would say when you look at Allen Robinson and his impact on this schedule, I would say he's pretty much the same guy regardless of who he plays. I looked at his splits in difficult matchups and in good matchups. Relatively speaking, he's kind of been the same guy regardless. But when we look at shadow corners, he doesn't really face any to start the season outside of Ramsey in the first game. He has like 4 pretty smash spots weeks 2 to 5. And then he faces Jair Alexander and Carlton Davis and a couple more difficult corners, Marlon Humphrey probably too, towards the back half of the season. So this is a guy that I would say Allen Robinson's probably somebody you want to draft, but maybe trade high after week 5.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like after that week 5, you're talking about in that stretch for those top 5 games apart from Ramsey. You mentioned the Bengals. They don't have a number 1 corner. The Browns could be sneaky because they did add to the secondary, but I still think at best they're probably like a league average defense against the pass. The Lions, who, as much as I love Jeff Okudah, he struggled as a rookie, and in general, he's going to have a hard time with Allen Robinson regardless. And then you got the Oakland Raiders with Casey Hayward. Is Casey Hayward even going to be healthy at that point? Like,
I didn't even know Casey Hayward was on the Raiders, to be
Yeah,
honest.
so there you go. That's your sell window after the Raiders game, after he torches them. Casey Hayward, Damon Arnett, Trayvon Mullen, whoever the fuck you want to throw at him. And then once he gets into that Jair Carlton, Jason Verrett range of his schedule, that's when you want to sell him high. Again, I'm expecting Allen Robinson in this stretch to probably be a top 7 or 8 receiver. But after that, again, he'll probably fall into the high wide receiver 2 range. And if you can flip a guy who's priced at a wide receiver 1, who you know is going to end up turning into a high wide receiver 2, into somebody else in that range. So let's say hypothetically, I don't know, who's like a receiver going in that range, like
CeeDee Lamb.
CeeDee Lamb gets off to a slow start. Terry McLaurin gets off to a slow start. Let's just say one of those guys. Maybe you could flip Allen Robinson to that. But apart from that, I do agree. Those Bears should have a very good start to the season, but I would flip them after that week 5.
Yeah, and I would say Darnell Mooney will probably have a couple good games towards that middle part of the season, because Allen Robinson will have to deal with guys like Jair Alexander and Carlton Davis, where on those teams, those guys are clearly the best corners on their team. So the secondary pieces are probably going to do a lot better in those games than Allen Robinson will. So in those 2 Packers games specifically, those will probably be types of games that Mooney does well. And I believe he played well against the Packers last year too, which makes a lot of sense.
Yep, absolutely. So anything else you want to add on the Bears, or should we go into the honorable mentions?
Yeah, let's move into some honorable mentions. And basically, the Colts and Steelers have easy schedules in general, but there's no stretches of time where it's like easy. It's kind of just like easy, hard, easy, medium, easy, hard kind of schedule. So the Steelers and Colts overall, I would say, are good. Especially the Steelers receiving core, they're going to have some easy matchups, and that is obviously a good thing, knowing that, guys like Chase Claypool, Deontay Johnson had been a bit boomer bust last year. So hopefully with a bit of an easier schedule than they had last year. And I believe they had a relatively easy schedule last year too. But overall, I think you can expect a lot more out of those guys. And then in terms of the Colts, we don't really know what to do with their receiver core right now. A lot of people are hyping up Michael Pittman. T.Y. Hilton's kind of left for dead. Anybody else in that receiving core, I don't even know who their names are. Like Zach
T.Y. Hilton.
Like I don't know. The Colts receiving core, yeah, they have an easy pass defense schedule, but like there's nothing that really excites me about their receiving core. So Carson Wentz might be a decent streamer for that reason, but that's about my only takeaway from them.
Yeah, I agree. And then when you're talking about the Chargers, again, it's the same type of team, but let's be honest here. The Chargers, they just need an above average at worst schedule.
Right, and they have for the first 10 weeks or so, they have like 6 or 7 good matchups. So they should be a team that gets out to a relatively quick start.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're talking about the pieces on that offense, like I don't want to say matchup proof. Like there's some teams, like the Cowboys, the Chiefs, the Bucks, no matter kind of who they play, they're going to put up points. I think the Chargers can enter that range this year. And if they're facing, as you mentioned, average to above average matchups, like this is going to be a team that can win you championships.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. So that's the positive side of the video. Let's move on to the harder schedules in the league. And it's almost, I swear to God, the last year when we did this video, me and Nick did videos on the strength of schedule last year. It was almost the same exact teams that we talked about. I swear to God, it was the same teams. So the hardest schedule in the league, according to us, is the Seattle Seahawks. And when you look at the Seahawks schedule, obviously they kind of fit into that mold of they have a very favorable schedule to start the season. Even though I think the Colts are going to be a relatively good defense, I would say the Titans and Vikings are going to be easy matchups for them. But aside from that, they have like 3 good matchups the rest of the year, and the rest of the matchups are a little bit more difficult, especially given the fact that they have to play the Rams twice in the fantasy season. They have to play the Steelers. They have to play the Saints. They have to play the Washington football team. Like, we're talking about those defenses are all top 5 defenses in the NFL.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, maybe the Saints take a downturn as well. We mentioned at the beginning of the video, but in reality here, even if they take a downturn, they're still probably going to be at least a league average, if not slightly above average defense, because they're well coached. Again, you mentioned that stretch. The Colts, people want to look at, the 19th ranked defense here. Yeah, but when you actually contextualize it and realize that this was a team that was top 5 to start the season, then once they dealt with injuries, kind of fell off. I think that's going to be a harder matchup than 19th dictates. I'm going to say that right now. Those 2 matchups in between the Niners, Titans, Vikings, absolutely smash spots. If you have these guys, if you drafted these guys, cool. They're going to blow up in that game. But if you drafted these guys and do not sell them after that Vikings game, don't be surprised if you're disappointed after that, because then you got a brutal stretch. Look at this 4-game stretch. Okay, I know what I mentioned with the Saints, but the Niners, who are going to be a well-improved defense with Nick Bosa and with some of those guys in the secondary come back. The Rams, who we all know how dominant they are. The Steelers, well-coached with a lot of talent on that defensive side. And the Saints, same kind of thing as the Steelers. Like that 4-game stretch, we wouldn't be shocked if any of these guys on the Seahawks ended up struggling. And when you're talking about the players on the Seahawks, how did they manage when they're facing against top 12 defenses or better? It's pretty bleak, because if you're mentioning Russell Wilson in particular, his points per game dropped by 6 when he was facing against top 12 passing defenses. And then when you're talking about DK Metcalf, dropped by 2 points. So overall, like I'm going to mention those two, they dropped significantly. If you get into Tyler Lockett, it's a little bit skewed by the fact that this guy had like 70% of his points in 3 games. But regardless, that goes to show that this team can beat up on some bad passing defenses, but when they're put into games where they're facing against good passing defenses, guess what? Pete Carroll's always going to revert to his tendencies and take the ball out of his passing offense's hands, because he either thinks they're going to struggle, or he either thinks, oh no, this is a game where I want to run the ball. So I know that's a very narrative-y, but at the same time, Pete Carroll is as narrative-y of a coach as you can possibly get in the NFL.
Yeah, and those guys are very predictable. When they've had good matchups, they've smashed. Like that's basically what the Metcalf and the Russell Wilsons have done, and which is why a lot of people, you hear people talk about Russell Wilson as a streaming quarterback. It's because he's very good in easy matchups. And like you said, with the Jaguars, Texans, and Lions, those might be the 3 worst run defenses in the league. So there's a good chance that in those games, Chris Carson goes bonkers and they don't really throw the ball that much. So there's all that kind of risk with the Seahawks. Again, it just adds to the fact that we're not overly high on the Seahawks this year at their current ADP, because they are very expensive, especially those top 3 guys, Metcalf, Lockett, and Russell Wilson. They're all going off the board at a point where you need them to be more than just boom or bust options. You need them to be more consistent. And obviously they're going to have boom or bust games because they're wide receivers. Not every receiver is consistent, but you need them to be more consistent than they already are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So number 1 hardest schedule, Seattle Seahawks. We can go on to the number 2 team. And this is the Las Vegas Raiders. And I alluded to it with the Darren Waller, but God, like what did they do to deserve this opening schedule?
Their schedule was brutal last year too.
Like, man, they don't have a single positive matchup in their first 6 games of the season. And when I mentioned, okay, maybe you can buy low on Waller. First of all, I think Waller is going to produce regardless, because this guy is an absolute baller. But if he gets out to a slow start, if Derek Carr isn't playing well, if this passing offense isn't humming, because the secondaries they play on that stretch is really good. Listen, you can package, again, Mark Andrews gets off to a hard start. You can package a Mark Andrews and I don't know, freaking
Henry Ruggs or something.
Henry
like
Ruggs,
receiver like that, like Elijah Moore maybe, if you want to get rid of him too.
Mark Andrews and freaking
even like McCole Hardman. McCole Hardman could have a couple big games early in the season. You might be able to package Mark Andrews and McCole Hardman and get up to Darren Waller.
Yeah, absolutely. But yikes, I wouldn't draft really any Raiders apart from Waller. Like I like Jacobs, maybe if you can get him at value, like if he falls to the 6th round. But in reality here, if we're picking straws here, if we're picking and choosing. At this point, like although we're looking strictly passing defenses, we're going to get into the run defenses later. As a whole, I mean, you look at the stretch, they're playing good overall defense, not just strictly pass defense. Like the Ravens have a very good front 7. The Steelers should be able to control the run. They're the best run defense in the NFL last year for a period of time. The Dolphins have a improved front 7. Like this is going to be a very big slugfest to start the year that I'm not looking forward to if I have any Las Vegas Raiders. So what are your thoughts on the schedule?
I think the important part too with playing good front 7s is the fact that the Raiders completely retooled their offensive line too. So it's going to be guys that haven't played with each other trying to develop chemistry against difficult defense. It's going to be difficult to start the season. So yeah, I like the 2 receivers late in drafts, Ruggs and John Brown and Darren Waller, of course. But Josh Jacobs is a guy I would imagine in home leagues, he's going to go a little bit higher than he's going in expert leagues and in underdog drafts, because for the most part, people in those kind of formats are fading him, but I feel like he has a bit more name value to people in home leagues that they might take him a little bit earlier than he's currently going.
He has a name, and they're going to see that he was RB9 last year. That's what home leagues do. You know it, Bush. You know that filter, sort by last year's points. That's what everybody in home leagues does.
Right, yeah. So overall, I would say the Raiders, I think they were like a top 12 offense last year. I don't expect them to be that good again. I feel like this is more of a mediocre type of offense, and they're probably going to get out to a relatively slow start, given the fact that they have a new offensive line. They still have all these unproven receivers. As much as I like Ruggs, there's going to be some growing pains, I think, early in the season for the Raiders. So they could be a team, a bunch of players that you acquire mid-season.
Yep. No, I absolutely agree. So we can move on to the next team. And that's going to be the Detroit Lions, whose head coach is doing up downs with them at practice. So what are your thoughts on the Lions schedule and why is it brutal?
Yeah, again, it starts bad, right? Like
Yeah.
this is a team that is playing 3 Super Bowl contenders to start the season. San Francisco, Green Bay, and Baltimore. Like that is going to be tough. And not only do they play very tough defenses, but they have a lot of moving parts as well, right? They have a new quarterback. They have a rookie starting offensive tackle. They have no receiving talent from the previous year, pretty much. Everybody is new. And TJ Hawkinson and DeAndre Swift are really the only pieces we're worried about from a fantasy perspective anyway. So this might not matter as much because TJ Hawkinson is a tight end. He can avoid, Jair Alexander, for example, because he's a cornerback. But overall, this is not a team that I expect to score a lot of points early on in the season. And it's not like they have any wide receivers to speak of. So it's not like we're like, oh man, Amon-Ra St. Brown's schedule is terrible to start the season, because I don't think anybody was drafting Amon-Ra St. Brown high anyway. But knowing that they play 3 really tough games to start the season, this could be a situation where we look at the Lions like this team's going to have the first overall pick. Like they might just get wiped the first 3 games.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if that's the case, give me all the DeAndre Swift stocks as possible in Dynasty. But anyways, yeah, talking about that schedule, like, although like you want to say the week 5 and 6 it starts to pick up, in reality here it's kind of boom bust after that, because then after those weeks 5 and 6 you got the Rams, absolute death wish. Then you got a decent matchup with the Eagles. Then you got the Steelers, Browns, Bears, Vikings, Broncos. Like it's just kind of all over the place once you get past those first 4 games, which kind of makes it a little bit of a stretch. Again, thank goodness that outside of TJ Hawkinson and DeAndre Swift, there are no highly drafted pass catchers from this team. But man, yeah, you're talking about a team that can compete for that first overall pick. Like we could be looking at a 3-14, 4-13 type of team this year.
Right. And I've already kind of expressed my sentiment that I think they're going to be a bit better than that, because I think they have a good offensive line. Jared Goff's capable quarterback. They have 2 good weapons on offense. But overall, like I said, I think this is a team that probably struggles out of the gate, given the fact that they were not dealt a very favorable start to their schedule. And that's what we care about, right? When in drafts, we care about the start of the schedule, because if you draft DeAndre Swift, for example, which is, I mean, he doesn't really get affected by this because it's past defenses, but if you draft DeAndre Swift and the Lions are scoring 13 points a game to start the season, it's going to be really hard to trade DeAndre Swift if you don't want him on your team anymore, because people are going to look at the box scores, right? And in home leagues, they're going to be, oh, the Lions have only scored 37 points in 4 games. How am I going to trust their running back? Like that's something you got to take into account when you're drafting a guy, right? Because if he does have the worst case scenario realized, is it going to be easy to move off of that player? And for the Lions, Hawkinson and Swift, it's probably going to be tough.
Yep, absolutely. So we can get on to the next team, and a team that always seems to have a brutal start to the season, but you can start it off with the New York Giants here.
Yeah, and they play 2 of the most difficult defenses in the league to start the season, right? With the Broncos and the Washington football team. And then again, the Saints, you said that I still think they're going to be a top 10 defense regardless. I think they're still going to be, they're very well coached. There's a lot of continuity on that defense. I don't think they're going to be a very
it's just a
scary unit. I just think they're going to probably be a unit we don't like for fantasy for simplicity's sake. So they got 3 of their first 4 matchups pretty tough. And then they also have the Rams in week 6. So 4 of their first 6 matchups are not positions that we want to see our fantasy players in. The Giants also are not a good enough offense to actually overcome these defenses, right? We have yet to see Daniel Jones actually do anything against a reputable defense. Golladay will likely have a tough time with some of these corners early too. We got William Jackson with the Washington football team. We got the Broncos corners, Surtain and the guys that are there. We have Lattimore in week 4. We have Ramsey and Darius Williams in week 6. So overall, I think this is a tough start to the season for the New York Giants, and especially their offensive line, which is not a good unit. They lost they lost Kevin Zeitler off that unit this year. They have Nate Solder coming back, but overall, I think PFF ranked them as like the 31st offensive line heading into the season, and they're playing some damn good defensive fronts to start the year, which, I mean, the football team, Broncos, Saints, and Rams are not going to be very forgiving to that offensive line. I would say when you look at Daniel Jones' splits too, he beat up on some bad defenses last year. He wasn't good for fantasy, but the games that he was usable were only against terrible defenses. He had 4 games against bottom 10 defenses, and he scored 20 PPR points per game versus 14 the other 10 games that he played.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, that is a big yikes. And we mentioned it a little bit pre-show, but could Kenny Golladay potentially be a buy low candidate once you get into that week 8 area, like week 7 area? Like, absolutely. Like the main bugaboo after that would be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But aside from that, it does kind of pick up a little bit to the point where he's either playing average to above average defenses in terms of matchups. So that could be a potential option. But aside from that, like, I'm not going to be trading for Sterling Shepard midseason, Kadarius Toney. Like, no, the only one I would consider would be Kenny Golladay. And again, you're never going to be able to buy Saquon Barkley low, but if somebody's willing to sell him, hey, maybe you can move a Nick Chubb for Saquon Barkley. As Saquon Barkley gets off to a slow start, and Nick Chubb is like the RB8 over that stretch. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but we could be risking the fact that this team is like 1-5 to start the season, and like Dave Gettleman gets fired, and like somebody else gets fired, and like then this team's a complete train wreck for the rest of the season, which is always a tough situation to invest in fantasy, even for redraft purposes, especially for dynasty. But in redraft purposes, it's still tough to invest in teams that you don't expect to be very good because things tend to go wrong. Like, you know, players start to get pissed off and start acting out and talk shit about their coaches. Players get suspended. Like it. When you invest in good teams,
Kelvin Benjamin steals food.
Exactly. It just makes your life a lot easier. So I would say that Kenny Golladay right now, as much concern as we have with Daniel Jones, as much concern as we have with Saquon potentially missing the beginning of the season, I'm getting lower and lower on Kenny Golladay when initially, when we started the offseason, he was a guy I thought I would own a lot of.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, like, if you're getting, again, his current cost is basically fine for me. Like, he's currently going off the board, like wide receiver 25, wide receiver 26. At that cost, okay, cool. I'll take the chance on an alpha who should get about 100 and 110 targets on a new team. Like, I'm fine with taking that plunge. But if he starts creeping up to like the wide receiver 19, 20,
and he could in home leagues because he's a big name.
Yeah, so at that point, I would be out. But yeah, like, if he stays at his current like price, like, I'm okay with investing in it. I would just rather prefer, if I'm high on him, if I want to get him over that stretch, to be able to trade for him, because that opening stretch, having to rely on him as say your wide receiver 2, would be pretty brutal.
Yeah, exactly. And those early season games for fantasy definitely matter a lot for your outlook on, you know, potentially making a playoff push and making trades corresponding to that. So the Washington football team, the 5th hardest schedule to begin the season throughout the season, basically. I would say, like, you got it written down there, but it's definitely a difficult opening schedule. That's the biggest takeaway from this.
Yeah, this opening schedule is brutal. Like, up until week 10, you have, like, on paper here, 2 positive matchups, and in that stretch, facing 4 elite defenses. And I do think the Packers might even take the step up to elite this year. Once Aaron Rodgers is fired up, that team's ready to roll, last dance, everything. Maybe they perform even better than 10th. Maybe that's the 5th highest unit. But regardless, even without them performing at that next level, the Broncos are going to be elite. The Bucs are going to be elite. The Saints, we mentioned, are probably still going to be a top 10 unit. The Buffalo Bills, I didn't even realize they were that good of a defense last year, but I guess
and the Giants are no pushover either, too.
Absolutely. So that opening stretch is going to be an absolute massacre. And again, I alluded to it, but we don't want to look forward. But man, it's hard not to look forward when you see week 11 on. They play like four or 5 of those games are legitimately against teams that probably should figure into the bottom 8 defenses against the pass. You're talking about the Raiders. You're talking about the Eagles. You're talking about the Cowboys. Those are
they play
the
Cowboys, Eagles, the final 4 games of the season. Like, that's insane to me. I don't know why that was scheduled that way.
What is that?
Like that every year too? Doesn't it seem like the NFC East is always playing each other at the end of the season?
Their last 5 games are against the NFC East. Their last 5 games.
Yeah, so they have 1 divisional game in the first 13 weeks of the season, which is just stupid. I don't even. And from week 2, it's in week 2. So from week 3 to 12, they don't have a single divisional game. That is super, super weird.
And then they just play 5 in a row to end the season.
Yeah, it's so weird. But either way, the Washington football team, again, this is an offense that we expect to be better, but I don't anticipate them being so good to the point that they can overcome the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense or the Denver Broncos defense or the New Orleans Saints defense even. And like you said, there's still some like the Chargers, Giants, like some of the easy matchups in that stretch are not easy defenses. They're like league average or better defenses. So yeah, this is makes me a little bit concerned for a guy like Terry McLaurin, especially when you look at the corners he's got to play in some of these matchups too, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But at the end of the day here, the reason why I'm still willing to take the plunge on Terry McLaurin is because we're not dealing with some ordinary receiver here. We're not dealing with like, if it was Kenny Galladay in the situation, I would be scared. If it was, I don't know, what other like random number one wide receivers are
Corey
out there?
Davis.
Corey Davis, like I actually like Corey Davis, but yeah, even Corey Davis out there, I'd be scared. But Terry McLaurin can literally separate against basically any corner in the league.
He had 2 good games against James Bradbury last year.
Yeah, so that would be one piece I'm still willing to take. But we're talking about the ancillary pieces. We've already talked. I want no part of Logan Thomas. Like, fuck that. No. JD McKissick, cool, but like his role is going to be.
Curtis Samuel's already injured in camp now too. Like to me, it's Terry McLaurin and Gibson for me for the Washington football team. I'll take the plunge on Fitzpatrick late as well, especially once we get to midseason and his schedule starts to get easy. He could definitely be a guy that helps people win some championships.
And maybe this is a bold prediction right now, but I'll tell you what, if you're able to get De'Ami Brown on your waiver wire in week 11 and just ride him through that stretch, you're talking about teams that give up big plays. And guess what? De'Ami Brown's calling card is the big play. So you're talking about the Raiders, the Cowboys, the Eagles, even the Seahawks. Like, those are teams that are susceptible to big plays. And that should be his role in this offense. Going 30, 40 yards down the field and making a huge over-the-shoulder catch. That's what De'Ami Brown's good at. And I wouldn't be shocked if we're talking about a guy that could finish the year as like a top 30 wide receiver, as one of the main targets heading into 2022 fantasy drafts.
Right, especially if Curtis Samuel is injured by that point in the season. Then we got an even bigger wheels up situation. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Like I said, we are going to be dropping the running back version of this video tomorrow. We'll drop that around noon or whatever time we end up recording that. But if you guys did enjoy this, as always, like, comment, subscribe to the channel if you are new. If you guys want to support us in any way, you can go ahead and do so by going to underdogfantasy.com, depositing using promo code FSE. And when you do that, deposit $10 at minimum, you get $25 free to play with on the site. And you'll also get both of our draft guides for free. And again, and also make sure, guys, to comment down below any of your league punishment ideas to get a guaranteed spot into our listener redraft league and a free draft guide as well for whoever's punishment we end up choosing. So in the next couple weeks, we'll probably choose one. We haven't gotten any so far yet that have totally stood out to us yet. So make sure you guys are just flying. There's no limit to how many you can comment to. If you have 60 punishment ideas, comment one on every of our next 60 videos. All right. Peace out, guys, and enjoy your Thursday.
Why you need the money?